Hello, my name is Francis Klein, and I'm running for governor of Wisconsin. This week we're going to begin with a small announcement. We're going to be holding an event in Madison on the weekend of December 7th. The particular details of this event are to be determined, so please stay posted and keep your calendars free for that weekend. With that being said, today we'll be focusing on energy policy in Wisconsin, particularly where we stand now in our state. Today there's going to be a lot of focus on various data points, so as usual, if you have any questions you would like to ask or information you want to contribute to our discussion, you can always comment on Facebook or right here on the YouTube live stream.
Hello.
Once again, I'm
running for governor of Wisconsin.
Is that me or you?
That's you.
That's me. Sorry. Where was I? Yes. So if you want to contribute to our discussion, you can always comment on Facebook or on the YouTube live stream right here. Once again, as always, my campaign manager, Matthew Wiltius, is here with me to add to our discussion. Matt, how about you go ahead and actually introduce yourself for those just joining us for the first time today?
Of course. Well, I'm Matthew Wiltius, and I'm Frank's campaign manager, as he's already mentioned. I first met Frank several years ago at Badger Boy State, and this summer we started working together on the campaign. And just recently he asked me to be his campaign manager, so the rest is history, really.
And again, Matt, I'd just really like to thank you for your continued support and commitment to our campaign. It's really been a pleasure.
Thank you.
So, do we have any questions from our viewers to start things off?
No, it looks like we're all good right now.
Okay, then. I'd like to start off this week by focusing on the issues with regards to energy that we face in our state, specifically those issues, as opposed to the policy that we would implement. I think we're going to focus more on that next week. So, I'd just like to start off by saying that in our modern society, there are many, many different types of energy. And so we have all these different types of energy and these ways of producing electricity and forms of doing what we need to do all around us. There are significant portions of our economy and our lives that are devoted to the production and use of energy. And for today, when we're focusing more on the issues facing the state, we have to really evaluate what is happening in our state economically, production-wise, and through many other issues for each of these different types of energy. So we can focus on things such as coal, we can focus on oil, we can focus on solar power, we can focus on wind power, many other various forms of energy. So we need to look at all of these various forms of energy that Wisconsin either produces or uses and see how that affects our state and our people on a daily basis as well as economically on the whole. So we'll be talking again about what to do with that information later and how to determine policy with that. But there are economic and environmental effects to every energy decision we make. And so we have to keep in mind as we're going through this. And I think it's just really important to keep in mind in general as we look at the issues in politics with regards to energy. It's important to keep in mind how these small decisions with regards to energy affect the environment and affect the economics of the state. So if, Matt, again, do we have any questions yet? Or if
No,
not,
we're still good. We're still good.
Okay. So continuing on.
Talking again about what to do.
Continuing on, I'd like to. That was you this time.
Yeah, it was. I was just refreshing to check for questions, and sound turned on. So you can keep going.
Ah, my face is changing. Okay. So if it's all right, I'd like to just start off with production and the different ways in which energy is produced throughout the state.
I think that's a great place to start.
So when talking about the production of different types of energy, we have to consider the different types of energy. So I'm just going to launch right into coal, I guess, which is commonly seen as the worst offense to the environment, for sure. With regards to production in our state. We actually have no coal mines in the state of Wisconsin, no active coal mines, at least none that I have found throughout my research on this topic. And so it's really interesting to look at the economic effects of that, because we have no coal mines in our state, and because there are so many coal power plants in our state that use that coal, we have a net economic effect of coal, of we're buying coal from other states, and we're spending that money to buy the coal. And so we have to consider, when we're making decisions about coal power plants, how much coal we are buying from other states and what sort of net effect that has on our economy. There is, with regards to other types of production, so we have natural gas, for instance, is another thing that actually Wisconsin does not have. And so we don't have any production of natural gas, we don't have any production of coal. I believe we do not have any, no, we don't have any production of oil, of course. Most of the other forms of energy we have at least some source of. But with those three, the fossil fuels, as they're commonly called, we don't have any production in our state. And so the more we use them as a state in various forms, for heating our homes, which is what natural gas is quite often used for powering our plant, or our electricity, which is coal, of course, and for powering our cars, such as oil. Every time we use these resources, we are shipping money out of the state. It has a net economic negative effect on the state. And so I think that's something that we really have to consider moving forward. However, there are many other alternatives in production for the state of Wisconsin and for the people of Wisconsin. We have other methods of producing energy that we can consider, such as wind power, solar power, hydroelectric power, and we actually have many biomass energy plants in Wisconsin, as well as one nuclear power plant. So there are these other types of production that we have to consider. And at least from my perspective, it seems as though if we were to shift the focus from buying these resources and producing the electricity in our state to creating the electricity in our state from the resources that we have, such as wind, such as solar, such as potentially nuclear or biomass energy plants, if we are to shift to that sort of production, that would have that net economic positive effect that we want, or at least it wouldn't have a negative effect. And so looking at the economic effect, again, of the different resources and looking at how that relates to the production of those resources in our state, we can see that because there are no natural resources with regards to coal, oil, or natural gas in the state of Wisconsin, we do have a much more, we would have a much more positive economic effect. We would have a much more positive economic outlook, I should say, with regards to production of energy, if we are to rely more on the production of energy that we can have, that we have the resources for in the state, as opposed to the fossil fuels, where we do not have the resources for. And so we can look at the numbers for that. For example, as of 2011, 63%, I believe, of the electricity produced in Wisconsin was produced from coal power plants. And so while we do have many other types of power plants, we have biomass, we have hydroelectric, and we have natural gas plants, we have solar, and we have wind. And I'm sure, at least for me, seeing the wind farms across Wisconsin as I drive through has been really interesting and rather exciting to finally see those go up in the more recent years. It's to me a sign that we are starting to source our energy from our state, but we are still lagging behind the other states. And the fact of the matter is, on a competitiveness scale, excuse me, on our competitiveness with other states, going into this production of energy, we want to have that. We don't want to have that negative drain on the economy, and so we want to make sure that we're sourcing that power from our state. And So having the alternate sources of fuel, such as biomass and solar and hydroelectric, is really beneficial to our state. So it's really interesting to see that and to see those wind power plants going up. But unfortunately, there is still the case that very little percentage-wise of that energy in our state total is made from the renewable resources, is made from those things other than the fossil fuels, excuse me. And so that is something that we have to look into with regards to the state. So if you don't mind, I'm going to pull up the actual numbers because I don't have the numbers right off the top of my head. So here we go. Here is the percentage-wise of electricity production, specifically with regards to electricity production in the state. This is as of 2009, I believe, these numbers. So coal, 63.1% of the electricity in our state is produced from coal power plants. Nuclear was 21.5% on this. I believe it's about half. Excuse me. Getting a little sick or something. So I believe it's about half of that value now because there was one nuclear power plant that has been closed. Matt, is that correct?
I believe that is correct.
Okay, and natural gas is 9.2% of our production, hydroelectric 2.4%, renewables 2.9%, and then there's some other sources of electricity within the state. Now, because that does not amount up to 100% of our energy usage, there's still some energy usage there, partially because of the closing of the one nuclear power plant. We've had a discrepancy in the state in recent years, in the past 3 or 4 years, where we are not creating as much energy as we are using as a state. And that has been made up for the most part, by purchasing energy off the grid from other states, which is an even more negative economic drain, again, on our state. And so having that ability to produce the energy, I'm so sorry, having the ability to produce the energy in our state, as well as the ability to have the resources for that energy come from our state, such as not having coal power plants, but instead sourcing the natural resources that we have, would be beneficial economically. So I've been talking a lot about economics and with regards to production, and I know there are many other issues with regards to this. I'm just going to throw it over to your ballpark, Matt. Do you want to ask any questions with regards to this? Do you think there's anything that our viewers should know? I know there's certainly more things I could talk about than production and the consumption of energy and the economics, but there are other issues as well, so I'm just wondering if there's any questions or if you want to highlight anything right now.
There's nothing I'd like to highlight right now. We do have a question
Okay.
that actually we talked about in our preparation for this, so it should be fairly easy for you to answer. It's on the YouTube comments, and it reads, it's from Nick Gardapi, and his question is, with energy, what is your take on fracking and the tar sands blockade going on in Texas and in other states as well?
Okay, so with regards to my opinion on fracking and the tar sands blockade, again, I'm going to be focusing more on that next week, on policy, on what I would do if elected governor with regards to these sort of issues. And so I'm just going to say, generally, right now, I would prefer to do some more research on that, and I certainly will do some more research on that issue and be able to deliver an opinion on that and a policy, not just an opinion, but a policy, a concrete policy next week. However, in the meantime, I would say that we can certainly talk about fracking and the economic and production issues with regards to fracking in Wisconsin. Obviously, there's no natural gas sources in Wisconsin, as I said earlier. There's no natural gas sources in Wisconsin. However, so there's no fracking. However, we can look at the potential economic impacts of fracking on purchasing natural gas, on the price of natural gas, and we can look at the potential impacts of fracking with regards to fracking sand, which has been, to my knowledge, exported from Wisconsin in recent years. And so we can look at those economic impacts, which I think I would love to talk about in a bit. However, I don't know, Matt, do we have anything else? Any other
Uh,
questions?
right now, that's our only question.
Okay. So, again, I don't want to make a specific policy position yet, and I will not be doing that until next week. But that is an excellent question, Nick. Not to invalidate your question. It's certainly a heavy issue that's been coming up with regards to fracking. I know there have been a lot of opinions and positions on fracking thrown about recently, and I will be doing that again next week. So you can look forward to that, I suppose. With regards to the economic impact of fracking, there is this sense of the effect on the natural gas price, which is something important that we have to consider. If I may, I'm going to pull up my link. I have a link to the prices of energy. There we go. So, looking at the prices of energy in Wisconsin, specifically with regards to natural gas, we are ranked 41, with highest price being first and lowest price being last among the 50 states. So Wisconsin actually has a relatively low price of natural gas, and that is partially just because of proximity to pipelines, to shipping methods, and other such things as that. The farther you are from such sources of natural gas as the Great Plains and the areas where they've been doing fracking recently, the farther you are from these, the more expensive the natural gas is going to be, and thusly the East Coast tends to have a much more expensive price of natural gas per 1,000 cubic feet, or per whatever measure you decide to use to compare the states. 1,000 cubic feet is what is used here. And for anyone who would like to look at this is actually a wonderful site. I would highly recommend looking at it. It's called the U.S. Energy Information Administration. Again, the U.S. Energy Information Administration. So it really has some excellent information and statistics based on comparing the different states with regards to their ranking and their pricing and their production of different resources. It's definitely something I would recommend looking into. However, the natural gas price in Wisconsin is relatively low, and so we have to look at that and say that is obviously partially because of the fracking that's been going on in adjacent states. However, it's also interesting. So there's a net economic benefit for us from the fracking in that way. However, we are still purchasing the natural gas from other states. So with regards to that, it would be economically more beneficial to us, on the surface of it at least, to bring down our usage of natural gas, just as it would be economically beneficial for us to bring down our usage of coal, because these are things which we are purchasing from other states. Again, it has that net economic negative effect on the state of Wisconsin. And so, while the increase in levels of fracking in places across the United States has led to a decrease in certain prices of natural gas in Wisconsin, and this is reflected in our proximity to recent sites of fracking, there could definitely be a more positive economic effect of us bringing down our levels of natural gas consumption simply because we are purchasing that from other states. So it's an interesting economic give and take there, is how that affects us. And so we can look at the prices of natural gas in our state and in states adjacent to us and really get that sense of how Wisconsin is benefiting or giving to this economic situation with regards to natural gas and fracking, and determine potentially, which is something I will be again working on for next week, determine whether or not it would be beneficial to have fracking continue, whether or not that's a viable alternative, whether or not that's a safe alternative, because we do also, of course, have to consider the environmental effects, and that's something that I know a lot of people are worried about. So we have to take all these things into consideration. But again, it's that economic give and take which I think is particularly interesting and which we can look forward to analyzing within the next week. I hope that answers your question, at least in part. I know that I'm holding off on the policy until next week, and so I hope that that's acceptable. Matt, are there any other questions on the YouTube group yet?
Right now, we are good to move forward with our regular discussion right now. So let's go ahead and do that. I know there's a lot of other things you wanted to address during this discussion.
Absolutely. So no further questions?
No further questions.
Okay. So actually, I'd like to continue a bit with Nick's subject to a certain extent of the production of frac sand in Wisconsin. So this is another area in which natural gas and fracking specifically impact the economy of Wisconsin. We have many, many mines and processing plants and shipments of fracking sand throughout the state of Wisconsin. There are, I want to say, at least 25 mines throughout the northwestern part of the state. Don't have an exact number on that, but there are these are many sites in which fracking sand has been dug up, has been mined out, has been shipped out to these states where fracking is occurring, and so so looking at that, we can see that fracking in that sense has that net economic benefit to our state. However, that of course will come at the cost of perhaps an environmental issue within that area. And that's again something that I'll be reviewing next week. So looking at the environmental effects of fracking mining is something that we have to consider when making a policy with regards to frac sand mining in the state, as well as fracking in general, and the usage of natural gas in production of electricity. I think I'm fully wrapped up with the fracking issue as of now then, if that's all right. So if there are no further questions again, I will be happy to move on to other things.
So right now we've talked a whole lot about fossil fuels.
Yes.
And this is not a question from somebody else. This is moving on. We talked a lot about fossil fuels. You briefly touched on what are usually branded as alternate fuels. So things like wind, solar, hydroelectric. You briefly touched on them, but I think it'd be a good time to go into details about the economics, the production, and the environmental impacts and health benefits, risks of alternative energies.
Absolutely. And so, yes, like you said, we have these fossil fuel energies, but we also have these alternate forms of energy production and energy production in our state. And these are things which I think I've been comparing a lot to fossil fuels in that we have a lot more natural capacity for production of these alternate forms of fuel in our state because we don't have any of these fossil fuel resources except, again, that indirect thing of frac sand mining. And so looking at alternate sources of energy is something that could be of particular economic benefit. But going through the individual sources is something that I'd like to do now. So, for example, wind. Wind power is a variable power source. So that's something where obviously, and that's one of the many complaints that is brought up against it, is that you have this issue of it only works when the wind is blowing, and so that's something that we have to compensate for, in effect. Wind power, to that extent, is a power source which, barring significant advance in electronic storage capacity, barring significant advance in the technology of storing that energy, is still something that wind power is more supplemental. It's definitely a good energy source, and I think it's something that's a policy. I really should avoid that. So, moving
Next week.
on. Moving on. So, I think wind power is definitely an interesting subject, and so we can look at the manufacturing aspect of it. There are many, many companies in the state of Wisconsin that manufacture wind power turbines. However, many of those companies are being sent out of state. So they're just based in the state of Wisconsin, but because we aren't producing excessive or copious quantities of wind turbines, that business is being taken out of state, although there are quite a few that have chosen to remain here. And so I think that's definitely a good sign of the economic viability of the manufacturing industry with regards to wind turbines in Wisconsin. It's something that I would love to look more into. We could use wind power, economically speaking. It's definitely viable. There are a lot of wonderful places to put wind turbines in Wisconsin, and there have already been wind farms put up. The wind farm concept has only, it has an upfront cost. It has a capital cost at the beginning, but it's not excessive. It's not something that is unable. It's not something that even local governments are unable to overcome. The production and placement of wind turbines. It's not an impossible hurdle, excuse me. And so that medium-range upfront capital cost, I think, to a certain extent, pays itself off with little to no maintenance. There are very few maintenance items with regards to wind turbines. However, one of the more major hurdles to wind turbines becoming a major power source in the state of Wisconsin is that there are many, many regulations with regards to them, specifically within state law. And it's something that I'm going to be addressing in my position paper tomorrow, is that there are all these regulation hurdles, and it's very interesting to look at those and see, maybe what could be changed or what affects the production and placement of wind turbines in various places across the state. So perhaps because of regulation hurdles, it would be more difficult to place wind turbines where they might be more economically viable. And so that's something to consider when making policies about those laws or about wind turbines in general. Obviously, wind turbines have a decent efficiency. They're an efficient alternative renewable energy resource. The safety of wind turbines is, as far as I've seen in my research, it doesn't have an extremely bad track record. There haven't been many issues with regards to safety. I don't know, Matt, in your research, have you seen anything particularly negative about wind turbine safety?
Not for people, no.
Okay. Yes, I not for people, and I've seen things with regards to wind turbines disrupting the migration of various species of birds. And that's definitely something to consider. I think that falls more under environmental impacts, though, as opposed to safety impacts. And so we have to look at the environmental impacts of those wind turbines. They don't release fumes into the air, but they are something that we're placing into the environment, and so we have to consider what sort of effect that's going to have on our world. Unless you have anything else with regards to wind power, I'd like to move on, actually, to another source of power.
Yeah, definitely. Go ahead.
Okay, so moving on to, I think hydroelectric is something that we could talk about next. So the nice thing about hydroelectric power is that it's next to a river, and if it's, well, it's usually on a river. And if it is on a river or a large body of water that is always flowing or always moving, then it's going to be running all year. This is a source of power that many small towns throughout Wisconsin use directly for a large capacity of their electricity. And so you have a lot of it. It's really interesting to see the map of all these different types of energy production plants across the state of Wisconsin and see hydroelectric plants just dotted all over the place. They're all small. They're all low-capacity, little-town hydroelectric power plants, but they work. And they work year-round, and they work well. And there are very few safety issues with regards to that. Potentially flooding were to fail. Potentially some sort of effect on the migration of fish, or I'm thinking salmon just off the top of my head, but there are few environmental and few safety effects of a hydroelectric power plant if it's not on the scale of the Hoover Dam, for example. The Hoover Dam obviously has a large environmental impact, but looking at the smaller ones, which are more common in the state of Wisconsin, the environmental impacts of those are relatively small. And so it's definitely something that is viable economically and has been done on many small-scale local levels. However, looking at the potential of hydroelectric for a statewide source of power, it doesn't seem particularly promising, simply because we cannot build another Hoover Dam. We don't have a river like that, but also it's exceedingly difficult to expand, to scale up a source of power such as hydroelectric, because it depends so much on the natural features of the landscape. Unless you have a really, really big river, you're not going to get a really, really big hydroelectric plant. And the only major river in Wisconsin, at least that I'm aware of, is going to be the Mississippi River on our border. However, that is on our border, and I do believe there are many protected environmental areas around that, which is fine. But we have to say, okay, it's going to be difficult to scale this up to a large source of power in the state. It's already providing 2.4% of our power, which is a significant amount, no doubt. There is a lot of power that is consumed, electricity that is consumed from the source of hydroelectric power. However, it's not something that we can necessarily scale up immensely. I think that's something that we should look into more. If it is possible to scale it at all, should we, and what sort of effects that would have in the next week's policy paper and discussion. Moving on, if that's acceptable. Again, want to check with you if there's any questions, Matt.
You've been hitting everything right straight on, so I'm just going to leave you at it.
Okay. Maybe I should just continue, I don't know.
Go
So,
ahead.
going on with solar power. I'd like to move on to solar power. There have been some reports of potentially dangerous chemicals in the manufacturing process of solar panels, and I think it's really interesting to consider that as a safety effect and look at, well, if these dangerous chemicals are used in the production and manufacturing of solar panels, is there a way in which we can get rid of that? I know there's a lot of advances that have been slowly occurring within solar technology and how we can make those panels more efficient and less manufacturing intensive. And so perhaps in the future, and even looking at it now, I think would be something that would be good to do, is to look at solar panels and look at solar energy and say, okay, is this something that we can carry forward as a state? So manufacturing-wise, it's potentially safety hazardous. Again, that's something I think I'd like to look more into. However, there are many businesses that produce, similar to wind, there are many businesses that produce solar panels in the state of Wisconsin. And so we can look at that and say it has this net economic effect, a positive effect on our state, is having these solar panel manufacturers in the state of Wisconsin. I've seen homes across the city of Milwaukee and Madison and other places as well where there have been solar panels on the roofs. And so it's definitely a good sign to see, oh, okay, these citizens are taking their power into their taking the power into their own hands in many ways and really producing their own electricity, which is definitely an interesting thing to see. The question is that scalable? Again, similar to hydroelectric. Can we put solar panels on all the roofs of houses? If not, can we make solar panel or solar power plants? I know that one of the ways in which we could potentially make solar power plants that would not have that manufacturing potential safety hazard of hazardous chemicals is simply making the concave mirror setup of a solar power plant in which light is simply focused to boil water, which works and is implemented in many of the western states. I've seen it myself. And it's a very interesting process and something that I think is worth looking more into. However, When looking at the energy production in Wisconsin, we also have to consider that we're not in a state that gets a whole lot of sunshine. We're pretty far north. We don't get as much sun as certain areas farther south, and we don't get as intense sunlight as certain areas farther south. And so looking at that, we have to take that into consideration and say, okay, is this scalable? Is this a viable economic alternative source of power? On the small scale, it certainly is. That's already been proven in certain buildings, houses, and businesses that have taken up solar panels as their own source of electricity. But we have to look at that and see, is this an economically viable statewide power source? There is also something to the environmental effect, again, looking at those hazardous chemicals that can potentially be used and be dangerous during the manufacturing of solar panels. But environmentally, the solar panel itself, once it is produced, is not extremely, it doesn't have much of an impact. It just sort of sits there and gathers sunlight and produces energy. So it's not something that would then have an environmental impact once it is made. However, it is the manufacturing process that I think would need some more looking into and determination of whether or not it is that viable statewide alternative source of energy that we might need. Moving right along to biomass energy is a very interesting form of energy production that I think gets a lot less focus than it deserves. There are a lot of biomass plants in the state of Wisconsin, and well, it's not something that takes up a large percentage of our energy production. It is something that is used in many places for industrial energy production, for small-scale city energy production, and it is an interesting and relatively cheap form of renewable energy. In fact, I read an article while I was researching this that showed how coal power plants and natural gas power plants could be retrofitted at a relatively cheap cost to convert them to biomass energy plants. And so the principle behind a biomass energy plant is simply that you feed it some sort of biomass, such as scrap wood from a paper plant or scrap plant matter from farms. So if you're in a farming community, or if you're in a logging community or a paper production community, there are often these biomass plants that you see where they can produce energy from the burning of these extra resources that would normally just go in a landfill. And so using those to produce energy is certainly an interesting way to get as much energy as we can out of the things that we grow. So, and because most biomass plants rely on fuel that would already have been wasted otherwise, would have just been wasted otherwise, such as the scrap wood from a paper power plant. Whoever thought of that, I think, had a wonderful idea that day, because it's just spectacular. You know, you have these paper plants that are taking in wood, and they of course have lots of scrap wood, and so those scraps are just going to the biomass plant, which then powers the paper plant. And so it's definitely an economically viable thing on a small scale. But again, a renewable resource, economically viable on a small scale, can we then scale it up to a statewide resource? And I think this is one of the few sources of energy that has that potential. Again, something that would need more investigation, but it has that potential to be scalable on a statewide basis. Because biomass, again, like I said, it can be used as a retrofit to coal power plants or natural gas power plants. So we could take the coal power plants, if this were something that were both economically viable and beneficial to the state and to the jobs of the people, of course, we could take those coal power plants and retrofit them to use biomass, and then simply cycle biomass through those power plants. And while there would still be the release of greenhouse gases, they could potentially be from things that we had already been wasting anyway, or potentially from a recyclable source, a renewable source, such as tree farms. There are some tree farms that could potentially be used as a source for biomass plants, and I believe there already are a few that are used as sources for biomass energy plants. And so it's definitely something to look into, whether that's scalable on that statewide level. With regards to um, the safety and the environment, it's definitely, safety-wise, it's just about as safe as any other, as some of the fossil fuels. So I would say it's a little safer, though. It's a little safer than some of the fossil fuels. So, for example, comparing biomass to coal, there is there is this sense with coal that there are many toxic fumes, there are many chemicals that are released into the environment, as well as greenhouse gases. And so depending on how well the coal power plant is filtered, how well that is regulated by perhaps the Clean Air Act, then it could be much more of an environmental effect than burning the raw materials that are not used in a biomass energy plant. And so having that biomass energy plant in many ways could be less environmentally taxing than a coal power plant. But I think even more so when talking about the environment, talking about safety, specifically with the environment, you have to think of the biomass plant as more of a part of a cycle, is what I think it can be. And so having the biomass power plant as part of a cycle of a tree farm, for example. So let's say we have a tree farm and a biomass power plant connected, and so this tree farm is something which is always giving trees to the biomass power plant, and the biomass power plant produces energy for the people, but those trees can be grown again. You know, they can be grown again, and they can take in the greenhouse gases from the local area that the biomass power plant was spitting out. And so it's something that can be, and will naturally be, by the economics of it, will naturally have a net zero, potentially a net zero effect on the environment in the local area. So biomass is something that's very interesting, I think, on the small scale that it's already implemented, and thinking about it implemented potentially on the larger scale of the state. It's definitely an interesting idea of how we could potentially take that energy and use it across the state. There's one more, unless you have anything else, Matt, with regards to that. I was going to move on to our last source of energy, which is nuclear power.
Actually, I do have a little bit of something, because you were comparing biomass and coal, and actually coal is one of the most, actually it may be the most, if I remember correctly from the research we did, dangerous, safety-wise for humans,
Why do you say that?
source of energy. And that's not only because of the toxins, as you mentioned, although it's certainly a heavy reality with coal, but also there's a lot of, you get mining accidents,
Mining accidents, right.
you get mining accidents, and it can happen from improperly used equipment. It may happen from just malfunctioning equipment, accidents.
Absolutely. So
Something
looking at
caves in. So coal is easily one of the most dangerous sources of energy we have. Of
simply
course,
because it's the power source for it is mined, as opposed to biomass, which is cut down if it were a tree. And yes, that's definitely something that needs to be taken into consideration. I didn't think of that. Thank you. That
exactly, yeah.
we have that mining aspect of coal, which must also be considered. I think that's not as much of a concern potentially for Wisconsinites, because coal mines are more out of state, but it's definitely something that we have to think about if we're talking about the environment and the safety of that method of production, because by buying coal from other states, we could potentially be, in a way, sponsoring mining-related accidents. I'm not saying that the state is helping to kill people, obviously. That's not my implication at all. But there is this sense of there are mining accidents, and we need to look at those as part of that system. So thank you for bringing that up, Matt. I'm very glad that you said that. May I move on to nuclear then?
Go on board to nuclear.
Okay.
I always get really excited when you talk
I know
about this.
you're
So
very excited about nuclear energy.
So I've been looking forward to this the entire session, this entire night actually.
I'm very excited about fusion energy, but that's because I'm an astrophysicist, and so that's really exciting for me. But that's not particularly a viable source of energy yet. So moving on to nuclear power. Although we only have one nuclear power plant in the state of Wisconsin, it is a viable method of power production. Given the risks versus reward, it's been proven time and time again, as far as I have seen in my research, that while the risks are extreme, they're very small chance. I don't want to say the risks are extreme. If something were to go wrong, it is extreme. However, the redundancies built into modern-day nuclear power plants are so effective in preventing that possibility from ever even occurring that the possibility of something going wrong is exceedingly minimal, which is why I think nuclear power is coming forward as an exceedingly viable option despite the few incidents that have occurred. And yes, they're scary. The few incidents have occurred, no doubt. They're very frightening. And so we have to make sure that if nuclear power is further introduced into the state, it would be well under some sort of oversight to make sure that would happen. However, again, that's more policy for next week, so I'll try and stay on the facts of the matter. So we only have one nuclear power plant in the state, and we used to have two not that long ago. Two nuclear power plants were producing approximately 25% of our electricity needs. And I think we have 7 or 8 coal power plants across the state. It's somewhere up near 10 coal power plants. And so comparing those number of coal power plants to the number of nuclear power plants and the relative amounts of electricity they were producing for the state, it seems pretty. It's a pretty simple. It's an effective economic comparison. Excuse me, I don't know why I had trouble saying that. It's an effective economic comparison to look at the, I guess you could say, power for your dollar, bang for your buck, whatever phrase you want to use. There is more energy that you can get from a nuclear power plant being built than you can from a coal power plant being built. However, we do have to think about the economic overhead, the cost, the upfront cost of building a nuclear power plant. And so that's something that also factors into the economic issue of nuclear power plants are expensive to build. And so that's definitely something that we have to look into, is that difference, that give and take between, okay, it's expensive to build, but it gives us a lot of energy for relatively low maintenance and for less nuclear power plants in particular. You know, you only need 1 or 2 nuclear power plants to produce almost 25% of our energy. So how would just a couple more greatly increase the amount of energy? And so again, thinking about that renewable energy source, taking it from where it is right now and trying to scale it and think about, okay, how would this affect us on a statewide level? How could we expand this potentially? And so it's a very efficient source of energy. It's actually, all things considered, actually, I would say one of the safest sources of energy as well. The hazards and the risks of nuclear power versus other power sources are relatively low because of all those redundancies that are built in. So with regards to safety, despite the fact that there have been these few incidents that have happened throughout our world history, and looking at those, yes, again, they're tragic, they're horrible, and they're something that should be prevented. But because of the redundancies that have happened because of those mistakes, and as a reaction to those mistakes because of these redundancies that have come into nuclear power plant construction, there is very it's a very, very safe form of energy. With regards to the environment, I think the only issue that is interesting to think about is the depositories of the nuclear waste after it's been used in the reactor. And so making sure that those are deposited in a safe place is something to think about environmentally and safety-wise, and making sure that it's not somewhere that will affect the people or the environment in a particular way. And I know that with regards to regulation and how that is done, that has been getting better and better policy-wise. And so it's something that would have to be looked at before really thoroughly considering how nuclear power can propel forward our state. Matt, is there anything else you wanted to quickly say about that?
There's always things I want to say, especially about nuclear.
Sorry, can you make it quick? Actually, my battery's dying on my computer, so.
All right, I'll make it definitely quick. Just let me know if you need to stop me. As a couple of points, you talked a lot about the nuclear energy and the safety of nuclear energy, and I think not only is it so safe because of all the redundancies, but you can actually evaluate that as even though you look at the dangerous, you say, okay, here's a dangerous event where hundreds of people have died from nuclear, and here's an event where 3 people have died from coal, but then you stack up and you realize this event for coal has happened 500 times, and this event for nuclear has happened 3, and then you compare the numbers and you realize we tend not to notice the accidents for a lot of energy, for coal, for a lot of other energy sources because they're so small, and we tend to notice the ones for nuclear, which is why it seems like so many more people die. I hear that a lot. It says it's a dangerous source of energy, but when you actually evaluate the numbers, whether it's deaths per period of time, deaths per energy produced, however you look at it, nuclear power is so much safer than other fuels available, other sources of energy available. I
think the only safer version of electrical production would be potentially hydroelectric.
I think you're
right.
Because
it's so benign.
I think you're right on that. So it's an incredibly safe source of energy. And also I wanted to bring up, also, you mentioned advancing technologies in solar, so I just wanted to bring up advancing technologies in nuclear as well. You have, well, right now a lot of power plants run on uranium, but you have a lot of research going on that went on in the 70s and is beginning to pick up again on running things on thorium, which is a lot more common and has a much lower half-life, which means that the radiation won't last as long from the byproduct energy sources, and also produces more energy than uranium. So that research is very, very promising. You're seeing research that actually takes the byproducts of uranium fission and uses that for fuel with a byproduct that isn't even radioactive or has a half-life so small that the radiation dissipates in almost no time at all. So there's so many advances right now being done by a lot of universities into fusion, as you mentioned.
We're doing research on that here, and that's really exciting.
Yeah, there's research going on in Madison, and I'm hearing also a lot of other things where even though fusion has been kind of slow to develop for the past several years, there's been some organizations that have made huge leaps, and based on a lot of the development, just looking at the past 6 months, there's not a lot that you could say, yes, we have this viable fusion, but what we're finding is we're very, very close to it, and it's very realistic to say that within the next few decades we will have fusion as a possibility.
Spectacular.
So it's very exciting, and I think looking into, well, I don't want to get into policy, and you're the candidate anyway, so.
And actually, I do need to cut it short. So.
All right.
Hope you enjoyed the video and perhaps learned something. And if you have anything with regards to policy or a position or something that you'd like to see discussed, then feel free to post a comment in the YouTube comments below on the live stream or anywhere on Facebook with us, and we'll be sure to try and get to that next week when we have our discussion on the policies with regards to energy in the state of Wisconsin. My video cut out during that, unfortunately, but we did get to everything that we wanted to, and so I'd just like to conclude by saying that there are a lot of energy types that we have to consider when talking about the different effects, both economic and environmental and safety-wise, in the state of Wisconsin. And so it's really good to look at all of these different effects of those different types of energy before we make a thoroughly evaluated and thoroughly thought out policy position with regards to them. So again, that's what we'll be doing next week, and I'm looking forward to seeing you all there, where hopefully we'll get to as many of the questions as possible that you guys have about policies, such as the one that was brought up about fracking. So again, those will be addressed next week. We have a position paper on this week's topic, which is the facts and the research that we did with regards to energy in the state of Wisconsin, and that will be coming out this Friday, so 2 days' time, around the evening. And we also have, as I mentioned at the beginning, an event called Hot Chocolate in Politics is what we're calling it, and that will be in Madison, downtown area, on the weekend of December 7th and 8th. So keep your calendars free as much as possible, especially if you're in the area, and we'll be sure to notify you as soon as we have the full information and details on that. Thank you very much for joining us. Again, my name is Francis Klein, and hope to see you next time.